Simon Dean, Calvert County Oyster Committee Chair. I'm in the wild fishery, into aquaculture, both cage and bottom culture, but the primary focus is on the wild fishery. We provide a lot of bulk oyster to the shucking houses. I do sell a lot to the local restaurants here in Solomon's and a few other seafood providers locally that sell by the bushel, mostly in the shell. So our wild catch covers all bases really. It goes all over the place.
My name is Rachel Dean and I'm a co-owner of Patuxent River Seafood with my husband Simon Dean. As far as the oyster industry goes, it's one of the components of our seafood business. We crab, we fish, and we oyster. So the oyster is one part of it. I do oyster alongside my husband when I can. I'm also a school teacher. So usually on the holidays and on the breaks and on snow days, I get to go with him. But I also play a role in the marketing and helping deliver and get them where they need to be. Well, I think that Maryland's oyster industry obviously was really built around the wild oyster, and I think it's really an important part of Maryland's seafood culture. So the wild fishery is really the fishery that's responsible for supplying the oysters for like bull and oyster roasts for local American legions and for doing oyster sculls in backyards. And I think that if we move away from the wild oyster fishery, we won't be able to afford to do those things. So the wild oyster fishery really produces an oyster that is affordable and the common man can eat versus a more expensive oyster that is grown through aquaculture and is a little bit more expensive on the market.
Bill Sealing, and I'm Executive Vice President of the Chesapeake Bay Seafood Industries Association. I actually had my own oyster business for a while down in Chesapeake Bay, and then years later a partner and I bought a oyster boat and went patent tonguing out here in the Chesapeake, and we did that for 4 or 5 years. And I can tell you, actually doing it is a heck of a lot different than seeing it. Nobody realizes how hard these men and some women work at harvesting oysters. It's really, they deserve every penny they get when they sell their harvest.
Oysters are highly political, and there's always arguments about what they can and cannot do to save the bay. I think that a lot of times we think of the oysters as being the cure, and really sometimes they're the symptom. And the biggest challenge that they face is the water quality. Those little critters need clean water to be able to reproduce, to be able to breathe, to be able to eat. So I think that the oysters, you know, we face the challenges that they face.
Without the clean water, a couple years ago we had a freshet that came and we lost most of the upper bay oysters, upper Potomac oysters, due to the surge of fresh water and other pollutions that come through upstream. It's not over harvest. It is basically what's uphill running down that's really taking a toll on us.
You know, it's hard to do a stock assessment on a critter. It seems funny, you think it would be easy because they don't move, but it is difficult, and it's difficult to predict Mother Nature. So sometimes the regulations aren't necessarily in line with what we're seeing. So if a stricter regulation comes along, it's not necessarily because we're seeing less oysters, but sometimes it's a knee-jerk reaction to something else.
We're seeing a resurgence in oysters. We're seeing them come back more and more every year, better and better, but we keep getting cut and cut and cut, and it's really disheartening to think that that's what's happening to your future. They continue to cut, and they continue to use this 1% number So we need the science and data to really match up to, we're out there every day, we see it. In the commercial fishery, everybody feels, and the viewpoint is, the commercial guy wants to harvest the last oyster, every one of them. Without an oyster, we don't have a future. So we definitely understand the importance of having oysters for next year and the years to follow. So right now we're looking great. We've got all year classes of oysters there. We've got from markets to juveniles to spat. So hopefully that cycle continues.
You don't ever get the last fox. You don't ever catch the last squirrel. You don't ever catch the last condor, and you're never going to catch the last oyster. There's always going to be oysters in the bay in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is just how important, again, how important the commercial fishery is, the wild fishery, to Maryland and kind of the fabrics of our community. If you go to Western Maryland, you're going to find an oyster scald in someone's backyard, and the only reason that you're going to be able to find that is because oysters are sold by the bushel and not individually. So the wild fishery really produces the oyster again, that we have at, oyster scalds in backyards and at legions. So I think it's really important that we understand that there's a different market for the wild fishery and the wild oyster than there is for an aquaculture produced oyster. And I think that there's room in the state of Maryland for both.